Coming up, the war over DOGE continues. Democrats show what they really stand for, and senior Democrats say that their party is very racist. And discussion about the FAA cutbacks get ridiculous. Karen Finney is concerned about federal layoffs in Kansas City.
Kansas City, 30,000 government employees might be laid off. It will destroy the economy of Kansas City. That's okay.
Why do you say that?
Because I'm reading what the individuals from Kansas City have been saying, that they're very concerned.
What do you think they're going to say when they're going to get whacked?
Of course they're going to say that. But my point is, do we think that's smart to live in an American city just go under?
How many American cities need a massively oversized federal government to stay afloat? I mean, isn't that says more about the city than the government?
But when did we get to the point where presidents are measuring themselves by how many people they put out of work instead of how many people they get jobs for?
Not a moment too soon.
This is crazy.
The argument put here is that it is crazy to lay off all of these federal employees. The issue with the Democrat pundits is that they assume that federal government jobs are all real jobs and hence productive. This, in many cases, is emphatically not the case. Often, the federal employee's job costs the economy far more than just the wage that is paid directly to them. It is also an indirect cost as they create ever more productivity-killing regulations. Getting rid of many of these jobs will lead to a greater number of jobs in the private sector and thus the economy as a whole. Then we have former US Attorney Michael Moore being completely tone deaf.
It wasn't a big enough cut to do anything. It was a completely tone deaf move. I mean, I find people are always interested in efficiency as long as it doesn't affect them. And it's strange to me that we got enough people to go and ride around the racetrack behind the presidential limousine and such, and to guard 3 residences, and we're never cutting people from there.
Once again, the Democrat talking point about job cuts. But he then complains about the number of Secret Service agents. Does this fool not remember the assassination attempts, plural, on Donald Trump during the election campaign, and the elevated danger to Trump due to, quite frankly, dangerous rhetoric that the Democrats continue to push out? If you enjoy this content, please like, share and subscribe. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt lays down the facts about DOGE going into Social Security.
Set the record straight on your show tonight, Sean, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do so. President Trump has directed Elon Musk and the DOGE team to identify fraud at the Social Security Administration. They haven't dug into the books yet, but they suspect that there are tens of millions of deceased people who are receiving fraudulent Social Security payments. And so their goal in going into the Social Security Administration is to identify 3 things. Number 1, to identify duplicate payments and to end them. Number 2, to identify payments that are going to deceased people who are no longer living and should no longer be receiving that money. And number 3, to protect the integrity of this system for hardworking Americans who have been paying into it their entire lives.
The fact is that DOGE desperately needs to look into the Social Security system. As you can see, Elon Musk released data of people where they have not formally been defined as deceased. Some of the numbers are patently ridiculous. I mean, how many 300-plus-year-old people do you know? Especially given that the oldest ever American only lived to an age of just under 120. How many of these unregistered as dead people are still being sent checks that are being paid with your tax money? This is the sort of nonsense that needs to be sorted out to try to ensure that Social Security is sustainable for those in the future. Then we had Mike Davis on the legality of DOGE.
If the President of the United States can't get this done, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a bureaucracy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The president is in charge of the executive branch. He has a constitutional duty under Article 2 of our Constitution to take care that our laws are faithfully executed. And that includes these appropriations by Congress and by these administrative agencies when they're spending money to make sure that it's not being misspent, that there's not waste, fraud, and abuse, that we're not sending money, for example, to the UN in Gaza to fund Hamas.
I really like the quote from Musk that was quoted here, that if the president cannot fulfill his duties, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a bureaucracy. And the reality is, the Democrats would prefer that we live in a bureaucracy, given that Washington is 90% to 95% a Democrat town. Article 2 gives Trump the authorization as far as DOGE is concerned. The last thing that we want is for the US to literally be funding the enemies of the United States of America, which has happened way too often in the past. Then Representative Tim Burchett on DOGE.
Happen? How did we end up where we are?
Well, that's an excellent question. And when you see people here in Tennessee paying 50% of their income to state, federal, and local taxes through through everything else, fees and everything else, and then they see us sending literally billions overseas to our enemies. I've uncovered $40 million going to the Taliban. A guy named Sean Ryan over in Middle Tennessee, former Navy SEAL, podcaster. He and another guy named Legend had brought this to my attention. And, last term, I could not even get the Democrats to bring it up.
Once again, more waste, fraud and abuse being highlighted. But the Democrats are the reverse of interested. In the last Congress, they actively went about stopping investigations into this waste, fraud and corruption, and at the time, they had the power to stop it. Now, without the constitutionally assigned legal authority, the Democrats cannot stop this, so they're resorting to lawfare to as great an extent as possible. But then you have to ask, what do Americans really think about what Trump is doing? Frank Luntz explains.
We wanted to have you on because you do a lot of focus groups. You really get behind the numbers, the poll numbers, to the sentiments of voters. And it's so interesting. You've been speaking with a number of voters who were Hillary Clinton 2016, Joe Biden 2020, and then went for Trump in 2024. How are these folks seeing the early days of Trump's second term?
Pretty well.
Really?
And they're reacting to it because they love the pace of change. They were very fed up over the last 4 years. They wanted action. They wanted results. They looked at prices. They looked at affordability, looked at immigration, and they didn't see anything happening. They still don't like what he says, but they like what he does. And these are Democrats now who felt that they were not securing the border. They were doing nothing to prevent illegal immigration, that nothing was actually happening. They wanted to see a reduction in wasteful Washington spending, and they're seeing that. So what they tell me is, I wish he would be a little bit less rude. But at the same time, they like what he's doing. They believe he's serious about it. And for the first time, they have confidence in the future.
Luntz is one of the preeminent pollsters in America. He has longitudinally followed voters for over 8 years, many of whom are Democrats. With these Democrat-supporting voters, although they don't like the way that Trump talks, seeing it as too aggressive, they actually like what he is doing. And for the first time in his surveys, Luntz says that they have confidence in the future. Obviously, Democrats' internal polling would be showing much the same thing, which is why we see such heightened desperation from them. Just look, for instance, at Democrat advisor Jessica Tarloff.
A lot of Americans were having a really bad weekend because of these storms. So over 10 people passed away because of these storms that were hitting the eastern side of the United States. 9 alone dying in Kentucky, people drowning in their cars, tens of thousands without power. President Trump signed the emergency declaration, but he didn't, as far as I know, put out a statement. He didn't go out there. He's not going to meet the families, as far as I have heard. And you say if Joe Biden had done this, if Joe Biden had shown up at the Daytona 500 while there were people living under emergency declarations and passing away in Georgia, a tree fell into a guy's house and ended up killing him.
Do you think this is a fair comparison?
Oh my God.
That you're
Why?
taking?
Oh my
You're taking.
God.
This is not a hurricane event. You're talking about storm. So he needs to respond to every single death?
No.
Then he wouldn't be president.
Tarlop's arguments are absolutely ludicrous. And what she says shows just how desperate the Democrats are. A tree collapses on a house in Georgia, killing one person. And that means that Trump should have dropped plans to attend the Daytona 500 and rushed to where the woman died. I know I'm exaggerating Tarlov's position, but only a tiny bit. This genuinely is getting crazy. The Democrats are still pushing for fringe issues and fringe views, which will keep them out of power for a long time. But they will use any possible negative argument that they can. Then we have James Carville and Senator Alyssa Slotkin, both senior Democrats.
I just want to make a disappointing observation. I think these people, the most racist thing that I hear is when people say communities of color or people of color, because that assumes that everybody that is not white is the same, which is that, like, it's horribly, I think it's racist to say, well, Filipinos are the same as Hondurans, are the same as Nigerians, are the same as Indonesians is absurd. And they just keep using this language, and I think they're too naive to know how stupid it is. That's my own view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the data will show you that it's just not accurate, right? I mean, you look at where, some of our Muslim American communities voted, where some of our South Asian American families voted. I mean, it doesn't work, at least.
They make the point that I've made for nigh on 2 decades, that it is the left, for all of their preaching, who are the real racists. They use racist terminology and seek to define groups by racial grouping, as if racial groupings are utterly homogeneous. That's why you get, for instance, Biden saying, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, as if blacks don't have different viewpoints. The fact is, people are all individuals. But it is not only racist terminology from the left, it is racist actions, such as DEI, penalising Asian students in terms of cut-off scores for college entry. It is anti-democratic and anti-meritocratic. But that is just the modern-day left in the entire Western world. Then we have Britt Hume on NATO and the European view.
By what the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, said about the U.S. position on this, which was that it was entirely fair and that the U.S. had a right to complain that Europe doesn't pay its full freight and have strong enough military to deal with the challenges that are now facing that continent. So I think it's, the president appears at least to got something started here. How it will all play out obviously remains to be seen, but he's got something going here.
It appears that with what Trump and most particularly Vance have said recently, there is some belated recognition by the Europeans that they have not been pulling their weight in NATO in terms of building up their military capability. There's been a massive decrease in defence expenditure in Europe since the end of the Cold War. The rundown nature of the military capability in countries such as Germany is shocking to see. It is time for them to make sure they pay at least 2% on defence. Then we have discussion on the FAA cuts.
There are 45,000 employees at the FAA. We're talking about fewer than 400 people, and he says 0 air traffic controllers and critical safety personnel were let go. So if that's true, I don't really have a problem with it, to be honest with you. I do like the idea of keeping the people who are in the direct chain of command of safety and the air traffic control system and so on and so forth. But I have a hard time believing that there is a single government agency that doesn't have a bloat of administrative personnel that we could probably do without. And I think that's why a lot of voters are happy that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are finally going through the federal government and trying to take out some of this bureaucracy.
There has been a lot of chatter by Democrats pretending that Trump, by having DOGE look at the FAA and thereby making some cuts, have materially adversely affected safety. The reality is that the cuts are bureaucratic and not at the operational side. The operational side of FAA has been left untouched. There have been no air traffic controllers laid off. This is not the PATCO strike situation of the early 1980s. And even then, with a PATCO strike and air traffic controllers being laid off, safety wasn't compromised. Then we have a leftist NBC, what else, reporter on FAA safety.
I did want to, underscore, to pick up on the conversation you were just having, though, in terms of the recent string of aviation incidents, Tom. This is going to, yet again, raise the concern about FAA staffing, air traffic control staffing. Now, this is a Canadian air traffic control tower, and this is under Canadian authority once it crosses the border. And yet, as you know, there has been this talk about maybe staff cuts at the FAA as a part of President Trump's effort to trim down the federal workforce.
This reporter goes into full ludicrous mode when talking about the Trump's cuts with the FAA. He insinuates that there have been cuts to air traffic control numbers. This is emphatically and explicitly stated by the Trump administration not to be the case. Then the truly ridiculous part. He points to an air crash in Canada of an American airliner as somehow being connected to FAA cuts. Worse, the fact is that the cause of the crash has not even been determined. But one thing seems obvious. This was not an air traffic control issue. Let's have a look at reality with a blast from the past.
Concerned because we have seen an uptick in serious close calls.
The NTSB is currently investigating 6 incidents since January and says just talking is not enough.
The NTSB has issued 7 recommendations on runway collisions that have not been acted upon.
Here we go back to when the Democrats were in office. And then Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg admitted that safety had been compromised. Further, you had the chair of the NTSB stating that there were 7 recommendations just on runway collisions that had not been acted on. This was under Biden, remember. But the Democrats want you to think it is all DOGE's and Trump's fault. What do you think about the Democrat war on DOGE? Please let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.